It pressed down on the town like a hot iron, bleaching the wooden storefronts white, cracking the earth into dry puzzle pieces, and turning the main road into a river of pale dust that swirled at the slightest breath of wind. By mid-afternoon, most sensible people found shade. The merchants fanned themselves behind their counters. The women walked close to the buildings, parasols tilted against the glare. Even the dogs had sense enough to crawl beneath the porch boards and sleep. But the cowboys outside Haggerty's saloon stayed put because young men with something to prove rarely have the sense to find shade. There were 4 of them. Boys, really, dressed up in the costume of hard men, boots too clean, holsters too polished. They leaned against the porch railing with their thumbs hooked in their belts, watching the road the way idle men always watch roads, hoping something worth talking about might come down it. Something did. The sound arrived before the sight, a slow, uneven clop of hooves on dry earth, not the confident rhythm of a working horse. Something older, something tired. The 4 cowboys turned their heads toward the south end of the road, squinting against the glare. A horse emerged from the shimmer of heat, gray-muzzled, broad in the chest but sunken at the flanks, moving at a pace that could generously be called a walk. One front leg carried a faint but unmistakable hitch in its stride, a quiet reminder of too many miles over too many years. The animal's coat, once a deep chestnut, had faded to something close to rust, dulled further by a thick layer of trail dust. And on its back sat the rider. He was a large man, or had been once. The shoulders still held a ghost of that width, but time had settled its weight into him differently now. His coat was the color of old tobacco, cracked at the elbows, dark with sweat at the collar. A wide-brimmed hat sat low over a face that the years had worked on thoroughly, deep lines cut from nose to jaw, silver stubble across a heavy chin. And beneath the hat's shadow a pair of pale blue eyes that moved slowly and steadily across the town as he entered it. He was perhaps 50 years old. He looked every single one of them. The first laugh came from the youngest cowboy on the porch, a lean, freckled boy named Cody who had never been further from Redstone Flats than 30 miles in any direction. "Lord Almighty," Cody said, loud enough to carry. "Look at Grandpa on his funeral horse." The others broke immediately. One slapped the railing. Another nearly choked on his tobacco. A woman pausing outside the dry goods store pressed her lips together and looked away, not defending the old man so much as finding the cruelty slightly distasteful. A pair of young boys sitting on the water trough pointed and whispered to each other, grinning wide. The rider gave no indication that he heard any of it. He guided the horse, carefully, deliberately, to the post outside the saloon and began to dismount. It was not a graceful process. His right hand gripped the saddle horn with more weight than pride would usually allow, and when his left boot found the ground, his knee buckled slightly beneath him. He caught himself, stood straight, adjusted his hat with one slow hand. The cowboys laughed harder. "Somebody help the old-timer before he breaks a hip." A shadow fell across the porch steps as Sheriff Dale Briggs pushed through the saloon doors. He was 32 years old, broad-jawed, and wore his badge the way insecure men wear expensive watches, making sure it caught the light. He looked the old rider up and down with the practiced disinterest of a man who had decided his verdict before hearing any evidence. "Town's not hiring," Briggs said flatly, thumbs in his belt. "And we don't much need old drifters sleeping in the street. There's a road going north same as there's one coming south." The old man looked at the sheriff, not a hard look, not an offended look. Simply a look, the kind a man gives when he has heard worse and has long since stopped measuring himself against the opinions of strangers. "Just passing through," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, carrying the particular calm of a man who had not raised it in years and saw no need to start now. He tied his horse to the post with quiet, practiced hands, patted the animal once on the neck, and walked into the saloon without another word. The laughter continued behind him. Briggs shook his head and went back inside. The cowboy named Cody cupped his hands around his mouth and called after him, something clever, he thought, but the doors had already swung shut, and the old man was gone from their sight. Inside, the saloon was dim and marginally cooler. 3 tables of card players. A barkeep polishing glasses behind the counter, sawdust on the floor. The old man crossed to the bar, settled onto a stool with the careful movement of a man managing old injuries, and placed both hands flat on the counter. "Water," he said, "and whatever's hot in the kitchen." The barkeep raised an eyebrow. "We got whiskey." "I know," the old man said. "Water." In the far corner of the saloon, half hidden behind a pillar and a glass of untouched rye, sat a small, weathered old man named Pete Dobbs. He had gone still the moment the rider walked through the door. His glass was frozen halfway to his lips. His eyes, wide, unblinking, tracked the old man at the bar with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and dread. He set his glass down very slowly. His lips moved. Almost no sound came out, just a name shaped by the mouth barely carried by breath. Then he turned to the barkeep and leaned forward. "You have no idea," Pete whispered, "who just walked into this town." Pete Dobbs had a face built for keeping secrets. 60 years of living had carved it into something like old saddle leather, tough, creased, and giving nothing away to those who did not know how to read it. But tonight, anyone watching closely enough could see something had cracked open behind those small, careful eyes, something that looked a great deal like fear. The barkeep, a thick-armed man named Gus, leaned across the counter and lowered his voice to match Pete's. "What are you talking about, old man?" Pete glanced toward the corner table where the rider sat alone, eating without hurry, his hat still on, his eyes cast down at his plate, unbothered, unhurried. Like a man who had learned long ago that stillness cost nothing and noise cost plenty. "That man," Pete said quietly, "is Harry Calloway." Gus stared at him. "That's supposed to mean something to me." "It should." Pete wrapped both hands around his glass. 25 years ago they called him Duskfire. Fastest draw in the New Mexico territory, the Texas Panhandle, and half of Colorado besides. Not fastest like these boys out front practicing in mirrors. He shook his head slowly. Fastest like, before you decided to reach, it was already over. Gus polished the same glass he'd been polishing for 10 minutes. That old man, Pete confirmed, rode with the Calloway Rangers for 11 years. You know what those were? Gus shook his head. 6 men, just 6. They cleaned out the Deaver outfit in 48 hours, shut down the Portsmouth gang without a single civilian harmed, rode into Colton Pass. You know what Colton Pass was like in '62? 40 armed men held up behind stone walls. Pete paused. The Rangers rode in at dawn. By noon it was finished. A card player at the nearest table had stopped pretending to study his hand. He was listening now. So was the man beside him. Harry led every one of those rides, Pete continued. Never lost a ranger. Never shot a man who wasn't already shooting at him. And then one day he just stopped. "Stopped," Gus repeated. Pete's voice dropped further. "There was a raid. Small ranch outside of Cimarron. Harry was 2 days away handling something else for the territory. By the time word reached him and he rode back," Pete stopped, looked into his glass. His wife, his boy, 8 years old. The saloon had grown very quiet without anyone deciding to make it so. He buried them himself, Pete said. Wouldn't let anyone help. Then he handed his badge to the territorial governor, turned his horse south, and nobody in official capacity ever saw Harry Calloway again. He finally took his drink. Until today, I'd have said he was dead. The card player closest to them leaned back in his chair and looked at the old man in the corner with entirely new eyes. Harry was soaking a piece of bread in the remaining broth of his stew, methodical and unbothered, completely unaware or completely indifferent to the conversation unfolding 40 feet away. Gus set down his glass slowly. Even if that's all true, that was 25 years ago. Man gets old, Pete. Yes, Pete agreed quietly. He does. The following morning arrived gray and close, the heat already building before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge. Harry was up before the town, sitting outside the stable beside Ember, running a brush along the old horse's flank in long, even strokes. Neither of them was in a hurry. Neither of them needed to be. He had heard the talk inside the saloon the previous evening. His hearing had always been sharper than people expected. He had said nothing, finished his meal, and slept better than he had in months on a cot in the stable's back room. He was behind the stable alone when he drew the pistol. There was no dramatic tension in it. No performance. He simply stood, faced the split-rail fence 30 yards distant where 3 tin cans sat on the posts, and let his body remember what his mind had never forgotten. The draw was smooth, not lightning fast the way young men practiced, all urgency and flourish, but precise. Economical. The motion of a man who had removed everything unnecessary and kept only what worked. The first can left the post before the echo reached the stable wall. The second followed. The third, 3 shots, 3 seconds, 3 cans in the dry grass. Harry lowered the pistol, studied the fence for a moment, then slowly holstered the weapon. He flexed his right hand once. The knuckle on his trigger finger had ached since a cold winter in '79, and turned to retrieve the cans. The boy was standing at the stable corner, 12 years old maybe. Dark-haired, barefoot, holding a bucket of feed that had stopped moving the moment the first shot fired. His mouth was open. His eyes were doing the arithmetic that his words couldn't quite manage yet. Harry looked at him calmly. "Don't tell anybody, son." Tommy nodded. Then he set down his bucket very carefully, turned and walked away. Then walked faster. Then ran. That night, Harry rode Ember slowly to the edge of town where a small cluster of wooden grave markers stood behind a low iron fence. Not the town graves, a private plot. A family that had passed through Redstone Flats years ago and never left. He dismounted without hurrying, knelt in the dry grass, pressed one hand flat to the earth and stayed there in the darkness for a long while, saying things that belonged only to him and to the silence. When he rose, his expression had settled into something resolved and clear, the look of a man who has finished asking himself a question he already knew the answer to. He mounted Ember. He would stay. The morning Harry Calloway walked into the sheriff's office. Dale Briggs was cleaning his fingernails with a penknife and had no particular interest in being interrupted. Harry closed the door behind him, removed his hat, and stood across the desk with the calm, unhurried posture of a man making a reasonable offer to a reasonable person, willing to accept that the second condition might not be met. "The Crale Brothers," Harry said. "I'll ride out to their camp this afternoon. Give them a clean chance to leave the territory. No blood, no trouble, just gone." Briggs stopped with the penknife. He looked up slowly and then, because he was young and had an audience of 2 deputies lounging by the window, he smiled. Not kindly. "That's so," Briggs said. "That's so." The sheriff leaned back in his chair and let the smile spread further. One of the deputies turned from the window. The other set down his coffee. The moment had the particular quality of a joke whose punchline everyone in the room already knew except the man telling it. "Old-timer," Briggs said slowly. "The Crale brothers have 11 men, repeating rifles, and absolutely no patience for elderly volunteers." He picked up his penknife again. "I'd hate to be responsible for scraping what's left of you off the Cimarron Road." The deputies laughed on cue. Harry looked at Briggs for a long, level moment. Then he placed his hat back on his head, adjusted the brim with 2 fingers, and turned for the door. "One chance," he said quietly without turning around. "That's always been my way." He sent word before noon. He didn't ride out himself. He had Tommy carry a folded note to the Crale Brothers camp 3 miles north of town. A boy on a fast horse who was back inside 20 minutes, breathless and bright-eyed with the importance of it. The note contained 11 words. Duskfire asks the Crale Brothers to leave Redstone Flats by noon tomorrow. That evening in the camp north of town, Vince Crale read the note once, then read it again. His two brothers, Cal and Roy, watched his face the way men watch weather on an open plain looking for signals. For just a moment, one brief, honest moment, something shifted behind Vince's eyes. Something old and instinctive that recognized a name it had heard around fires and in bunkhouses for the better part of 2 decades. Then he crumpled the note, dropped it in the dirt, and laughed. But Cal and Roy exchanged a glance that Vince didn't see. Noon arrived the way trouble always does in small towns, slowly, and then all at once. The main road of Redstone Flats emptied with quiet efficiency. Doors closed. Windows cracked open just enough for eyes. Mothers pulled children back from porch rails. The barkeep Gus stood in the saloon doorway with his arms folded and his jaw set. Pete Dobbs had taken his position at the far end of the street, hat in hand, watching with the grave patience of a man who already knew what he was about to witness. Sheriff Briggs stood on his porch. He did not walk out to the street. Harry emerged from the stable at 5 minutes before noon. Same coat, same hat, same slow, deliberate walk that his bad knee demanded and his bearing refused to apologize for. He moved to the center of the road and stopped, standing loosely, hands at his sides, and waited. The Crale brothers came in from the north end, Vince in front, Cal and Roy flanking slightly behind, all three riding in, which was either arrogance or miscalculation. They pulled up 30 yards from Harry and dismounted. Vince stepped forward, thumbs in his belt, wearing the wide grin of a man performing for an audience. "Duskfire," Vince said, tasting the name mockingly. "You've got some nerve, old man. I'll give you that for free." "I gave you a chance to leave," Harry said simply. "That offer's closed now." Vince's grin tightened at the edges. "There's 3 of us." "I know how to count," Harry said. What happened next lasted approximately 4 seconds. Vince drew first, fast, genuinely fast, the kind of fast that had served him well for 10 years across 4 territories. His gun cleared leather cleanly. Harry's was already up. The shot took the weapon clean from Vince's hand, not his hand, just the weapon, spinning it into the dust 10 feet away. Vince stared at his empty palm with an expression of pure bewilderment. Cal went for his gun from the right. Harry pivoted, one smooth, unhurried motion, and put a shot through Cal's holster strap, dropping the entire rig to the ground without a scratch on the man wearing it. Roy, to his credit, actually got his pistol level before Harry's third shot sent it skittering across the road. 3 shots, 4 seconds, 3 men standing unarmed and entirely intact in the midday sun. Silence pressed down on Redstone Flats like a held breath. Then a child clapped. Small hands, uncertain rhythm, but it broke the stillness like a stone breaks water. Pete followed, his old hands coming together slowly and deliberately. Then Gus. Then the card player from the saloon. Then the merchant whose face still carried the bruise Vince Crale had given him 2 days prior. Then the whole street, rolling outward from the center like a wave finding its shore. Vince Crale picked up his ruined gun with one shaking hand, looked at Harry Calloway with something that had moved well past arrogance into a territory he had no map for, and walked back to his horse without a single word. His brothers followed. They rode north and did not look back. Briggs stepped down from his porch. His voice, when it finally came, had lost its previous architecture entirely. "Stay," he said. "Be our marshal. Town needs a man like—" "No," Harry said quietly, not unkindly, simply finally. "I'm not that man anymore. I just did what needed doing." He walked back to the stable. He saddled Ember without rushing. He tied his single saddlebag, checked the cinch twice the way old riders always check it twice, and led the horse out into the street. Pete was waiting near the post where Harry had tied Ember that first afternoon, the same post where the laughter had been loudest. The old man said nothing. He simply reached up and put one hand briefly on Harry's arm, and in it was everything that words would only have diminished. Harry nodded once, mounted slowly. His knee took the effort the same way it always did, and he gripped the saddle horn the same way he always did. Nobody laughed. He turned Ember south and rode at that same unhurried pace, the same slow, uneven walk that had drawn mockery 2 days ago from men who measured everything by its appearance and nothing by its depth. The horse and rider grew smaller against the open land, the dust rising gently behind them in the still afternoon air. The entire town stood in the street and watched until they were gone. The men who had laughed that first afternoon now held their hats against their chests, not out of pity, but out of honor.